Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones that we get to pick and choose for ourselves.
Here in the UK, we're taking down the flags and bunting for the coronation, only to hastily put it up again for Eurovision. We're also starting to feel the lure of outdoor picnics and cold water swims as the days get longer and summer doesn't seem so far away. And of course, as always, we've got plenty of books on the go.
Over here in Vancouver, we've got a heat wave headed our way. So after a cold grey April, it looks like we're jumping straight into summer. On that theme, I've got some fine early summer holiday reading on my stack, which includes romantic comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld, the best-selling author of American Wife and Rodham, Pineapple Street, the brand new debut novel from Jenny Jackson that has become an instant New York Times bestseller, followed by the much more challenging, let's say, Demon Copperhead, Barbara Kingsolver's latest novel, which just won the Pulitzer Prize in the US, has made the shortlist for the Women's Prize for Fiction in the UK, and which has over 22,000 five-star reviews.
As for me, I've been living it up with Really Good Actually, the debut novel from Schitt's Creek writer Monica Heisey. Still looking for light-hearted fun, I powered through This Much Is True, the no-holds-barred memoir from the head of Hufflepuff, Miriam Margolyes. And reacquainted myself with Greek mythology thanks to Natalie Haynes and her best-selling novel, Stone Blind.
We'll also run through the books we've currently got on the go and the ones we can't wait to get to. All that's coming up here on the Book Club Review.
The Guardian's reviewer, Laura Feigl, said of romantic comedy, "It's a moving and compulsive novel, and I had the happiest of weekends reading about Sally and Noah being funny and kind and having great sex." Which reassured me slightly after Rodham, because what I remember chiefly about that book was all the awful sex. How did you get on with romantic comedy?
Well, I too had the happiest of weekends reading romantic comedy. I mean, if anyone was going to write a good romantic comedy, it would be Curtis Sittenfeld. She is a very fine writer. All of her novels, except for maybe Rodham, are really, really propulsive, and they sweep you up and into worlds that you kind of know you want to be in, but maybe don't. American Wife was my first experience of her. That was a book club book. Oh gosh, like 15 years ago. That is a fictional portrait of Laura Bush. So very much like, what? Who would want to read that? Great book. Rodham, we gave that the book club treatment in a past episode. That's a weak one, but I also loved her more recent short stories. So when I saw that romantic comedy had finally been released, like I knew it was coming, I hopped straight onto it. I was actually headed out on holiday, so I was flying down to the States when I started it, and it's so enjoyable. It's the story of Sally Mills, who is a comedy sketch writer for basically the equivalent of Saturday Night Live. I think she's in her late 30s. She's very successful in her career. She's really pioneered more feminist sketch comedy on the show. And the first third of the book, we go through a week of production leading up to the live show. So that even in itself is super entertaining to understand what goes into writing a weekly comedy show. But then we have, of course, the romance element. And the guest for the week is Noah Brewster, who's a very handsome singer-songwriter, very well established, has been around for 15, 20 years. And they're pitching ideas for him to take on. And Sally's pitch is that she wants to do a sketch called the Danny Horst Rule. Now, Danny Horst is one of her fellow sketch writers. He's kind of small and unassuming. She doesn't say he's unattractive, but she shares an office with him. He farts, he belches. He's like her little brother. And he's recently started dating Annabelle Lilly, who is beautiful young famous actress. And Sally really wants to send up the fact that her male colleagues, these unassuming, unsensational, seemingly ordinary comedy writers, are able to bag amazingly beautiful actresses. And there's this dichotomy, is that the word for it, between the expectations of what's acceptable in a male-female relationship. i.e., it's okay if the woman's beautiful so long as the man's wealthy and or interesting. So she wants a sketch, and she's pitching this to Noah Brewster and the rest of the panel. She wants a sketch where Noah goes out with an unassuming, unflashy woman and gets arrested for breaking the Danny Horse rule. And that's their very first interaction, as she's pitching this to Noah. And he says, well, so to be clear, this is what you're saying. And she's like, yeah. And he's like, that's not really something I would want to align myself with. But, I see what you're going for. It all just goes on from there. But that's the very first interaction. I'm not going to tell you the plot because that would spoil the surprise. But it is all sorts of wish fulfillment, of course, right? That you could be this smart, sparky, successful woman who's kind of given up on love, and that you would be seen and recognized by this amazingly handsome, talented global superstar who, of course, no one really understands until you guys get to know each other. It's fun. Yeah.
And did it surprise you? I feel like the cynic in me says, she called it romantic comedy, which even in just the title seemed designed to immediately make it pop up in every algorithm's SEO search terms or whatever. And I don't know, sometimes you think, maybe authors think, God, I just really like to make a lot of money. I'm just going to write something that checks all the boxes, or is it more than that?
No, well, I kind of think, and I don't know that it's necessarily cynical, but that's actually Curtis Sittenfeld's USP, is that she writes about famous people or about fame. Even here, if that fame is fictionalized. Fame and interacting with celebrities is a theme that comes up again and again in the short story collection I read most recently. And then, of course, Rodham and American Wife are cut from the same cloth. I do think she's written other books, maybe that don't play on this, but whether it's done cynically or not, it's really what she's about. And she's spot on. She's making decisions that the best screenwriters make, I think, when they're writing for mass market appeal. But she can pull it off. She's a really strong writer. I wouldn't want to say that all the prose is perfect, because I'm pretty sure, Kate, at some point their bodies slam against each other and you're just like, oh God.
As long as it's not real people, it was the whole Hillary and Bill thing that I just couldn't get over.
Well, and I think this quote that you pulled out is also nails it too, is that they're being funny and kind and they're having miscommunication and they're getting it wrong. And yeah, there's some great sex. The main surprise for me, and I don't think this is giving it away based on everything else that's out there, but I actually thought she might twist it so that it wasn't happily ever after. And so there was an element of me wondering, okay, all right, where are we going? What's going to happen? And I didn't really need to worry.
Sometimes it's good not to be surprised, isn't it? In a world where you can't be sure of anything, actually, sometimes you just want a book where you know where it's going and it doesn't pull the rug out from under your feet.
I am sad I don't own a copy of it at this point. I read it on my Kindle because I could 100% see me rereading it in the way that you and I reread Georgette Heyer novels sometimes for just comfort food. Yeah.
That is an endorsement. Wow, that's interesting. Well, let me drag you away from that. I would immediately say, well, yes, that sounds great, and I rushed to read it, but I almost slightly feel like I've already read my feel-good romantic comedy of the summer, and that is a book by Monica Heisey, who is, like Sittenfeld's fictional character, a real-life screenwriter for the show Schitt's Creek, which I love. I hardly watch any television ever, but even I watched a season or two of Schitt's Creek and loved it. So I know she's good, and this is her novel, really good actually. I know I always rail at you if you just read the blurb and accuse you of being lazy, but can I just read the blurb of this one?
Yeah, all right. I'll hold it against you.
They sum it up really succinctly. That's right. You can just remember this the next time. I'm like, Laura, we should write our own blurbs. Maggie's marriage has ended just 608 days after it started, but she's fine. She's doing really good, actually. Sure, she's alone for the first time in her life, can't afford her rent, and her obscure PhD is going nowhere. But at the age of 29, Maggie is determined to embrace her new status as a surprisingly young divorcee. Soon she's taking up sadness hobbies, getting back out there sex-wise, and oversharing in the group chat. As Maggie throws herself headlong into the chaos of her first year of divorce, she finds herself questioning everything, including, why do we still get married? Did I fail before I even get started? And how many 4 a.m. delivery burgers do I need to eat until I am happy? So it's one woman's not quite midlife crisis. She got married relatively young, 27, and it's over 2 years later. And so she's washed up, divorced at 29. while most of her friends are still sort of finding their life partners and settling down and sorting their lives out. So she's really adrift, but she's trying to make the best of it. She's trying to do all the right things. It is absolutely packed, line after line after line, with this whip smart, very clever, spot on observational humour that you really recognise and respond to. She just does that so well. And that is very enjoyable to read, but there's not much plot to it. That is the plot, basically. You've just got this woman. She's living her life. She's got her friendship group. She's trying to carry on with her job and focus on that. And she lives in, actually, it's a Canadian setting. She's in Toronto. So there's much, a bit like when we read Maria Semple's book, Where'd You Go, Bernadette? And there's a lot of grumbling about Seattle, how much she hates it because it rains all the time. There's actually some good-hearted ribbing of Toronto. But also, I wonder, I feel like if you lived in Toronto, it's quite an affectionate portrait of that city, I think, with all the little neighbourhoods. And, you know, someone like me reading it from London, don't know Toronto at all. I felt like I got to know it quite well. Anyway, yeah, so I was enjoying it. There was a part of me that was thinking, is this enough? There's not really much of a story. And after a while, you start to feel like, yes, the jokes are good, but I didn't feel like there was anything really pulling me through it. And then you get a hint that it's going to be a romantic comedy. You get this hint of this relationship, this new relationship that comes along. So that slightly becomes the hook. God knows, it's like a dog with a whistle or whatever, isn't it? Why should that be so compelling? We were talking the other day, weren't we, about the sort of will they, won't they plot. And why is that so endlessly fascinating? But nonetheless, you get a bit of that. And so it's like, oh, great, you know, that sort of carries you through. And then I thought it went to a really interesting place. I was full of admiration for what in some ways is quite a sort of fluffy novel, I suppose. Or perhaps not that, but it doesn't feel like it's meant to be too serious. And what I thought she did really brilliantly was she managed to combine this really enjoyable writing with actually something deeper and more interesting about loneliness and about fitting in and how it's all too easy to just become unraveled. And when we do lose our way, how do we find our way back? And I really enjoyed the place that she takes it to at the end, which was not what I expected. It did surprise me. And I found myself feeling like, wow, she's really pulled this off. She's written a really funny, smart, interesting book that actually leaves you with something profound, I think, about life. Well, that's what I took from it anyway. So yeah, that was a real surprise and a delight.
So fun fact, I have seen that book on the shelf in my grocery store. This is a major update for both
like
Kate and for listeners. Yeah, is that I discovered that my posh grocery store down the road, even better than Waitrose, I would say. I'd say even better than Whole Foods. Anyway, that's irrelevant. Behind the magazines, they have a bookshelf. And so I saw that book there and thought about giving it a try. But I also saw and then read my next book for discussion, Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson. All of which is to say that I think I'm actually going to now use that shelf in my grocery store as my go-to place when I need, you know, it's like not critically acclaimed, commercially acclaimed, easy reading. What I hadn't appreciated is that Pineapple Street is brand new. I never read anything quite so new. I mean, I should flag romantic comedy is also brand new, but I'd read Sittenfeld before, whereas Pineapple Street is a debut novel.
How does a debut novel become an instant New York Times bestseller?
Pedigree, let me read you the author's bio. It will tell you all. Jenny Jackson is a vice president and executive editor at Knopf Doubleday. So two things. I mean, she could not be more embedded in book publishing, but also she's a storyteller and editor and would have the perfect taste and judgment call to write a best-selling novel. Pineapple Street, if you didn't know, is an actual street in Brooklyn Heights. And my follow-on research reveals that Jenny Jackson lives in Brooklyn Heights, that she lived in an apartment on Pineapple Street at one point. Somewhat similar to you and your experience of spending time in Toronto with really good, actually. I now feel like I know Brooklyn Heights in a way. It's the story of the Stockton family. There's the eldest daughter, Darlie, who's married and has 2 kids and is grappling with the fact she left her high-profile job at Goldman Sachs behind her. There is Georgiana, who's the youngest daughter of the Stockton family, who is young, making mistakes, working for a nonprofit, feeling virtuous, while also, you know, running around with her very wealthy friends. And then there's Sasha, who's actually their sister-in-law, who's married their brother Cord, who's recently moved into the Stockton family home in Brooklyn Heights on Pineapple Street. And her in-laws have moved into a penthouse down the road, but they haven't taken their possessions with them. So she's moved into basically like a heritage museum piece with all of the family's furniture still there, all of the family's paraphernalia. Her sister-in-law's rooms have not been vacated. They're still full of high school trophies and all the like. And she herself comes from a very blue-collar background, and so she's struggling to understand this upper crust, uptight, very tight-knit family and her place in it. And then, perhaps again, similar to Really Good actually, not a huge amount happens. We switch between the perspectives of the three women and the challenges they're facing in their life and their career with their children. The youngest provides the most drama because she begins to have a secret relationship at work, and that turns out unexpectedly in a way that becomes a point of crisis for her and then for the family. It's kind of everything you would want in a fairly lightweight family comedy drama. It's not a romantic comedy, I would say, or not quite. I mean, that's not the full focus, but there is will they, won't they, with a bit of payoff too. I would be remiss if I didn't say that all of this enjoyable commercial fluff is wrapped around a fairly gentle examination of the weight of inherited wealth and the issues of inherited wealth, which with all the characters in the Stockton family having significant trust funds that require prenups to be signed or not signed, and the consequences of that, and the warping effect of the money in terms of how they understand their relationships with other people and maybe what that means for their own family unit, holding tighter and tighter. Jenny Jackson opens it with a quote from the New York Times, and it says, "Millennials will be the recipients of the largest generational shift of assets in American history, the Great Wealth Transfer, as finance types call it. Tens of trillions of dollars are expected to pass between generations in just the next decade." So yeah, there's this slightly... it's definitely not challenging, but interesting line about what wealth does, how does it distort people's lives, what are the repercussions, what inequalities result. I really enjoyed it. I couldn't really fault it in many ways. Other than, like romantic comedy, we're really exclusively preoccupied here with the 1%, which is such a distorting view of American culture, isn't it? And framed how I then went on to read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver.
Interesting. Well, I was just looking at what people have been saying about it here in the UK. It seems to have been very well reviewed here as well. Nick Hornby said, Jenny Jackson has written a lovely, absorbing, acutely observed novel about class, money and love. These are the themes of Henry James and Jane Austen, but they are observed with a fresh eye and a contemporary voice. And then Bridget Jones' author, Helen Fielding. I loved Pineapple Street. The characters are complex and engaging, and their stories bring a particular slice of New York magically alive. So wise, emotionally honest, and such fun. Yeah. Actually, scrolling down, it goes on and on and on. So it's one of those books where I'm like, why haven't I never heard of this book before? It feels like it should have been on my radar. But yeah, that sounds great.
What's next for you?
What's next for me? I just realised how much of a female-centric bookshelf we're doing today. Sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles. I read This Much Is True by Miriam Margolyes. Miriam Margolyes, for anyone who doesn't know her, I wonder if she's as familiar in America. And I think she's actually, I was going to say Australia, but I think actually she's probably, if anything, more well-known in Australia because her wife or her partner is Australian and she's actually lived there and had quite a high-profile career there as well. But yeah, British actress, famous for, well, she's had such a long career. She's famous for these very characterful parts. She's quite a forceful presence and she specialises in going on Graham Norton and saying utterly outrageous things to completely confounded American celebrities like Matthew Perry, who just can't. There's a very funny one with Stanley Tucci where he just looks gently pained and wistfully says he wishes he was going to be on a programme that was actually going to make the air because of all the filth that's coming out of her mouth. I think what people respond to in her and what certainly comes across very, very, very strongly in this book is that she is herself. She is utterly unafraid of being herself and she's proud of who she is. And in this book, you get to understand the things that go into making a person like that. I had been curious to read it because I'd heard it was very funny. I'd also heard from people that, yeah, sure, they were enjoying it, but it's a bit relentless. Someone told me that, I got about halfway through it and then I felt like, okay, I get it now. I've had enough. So I was half expecting that I would maybe feel the same. And my biggest surprise was how much I enjoyed it throughout and how interesting she is. She is such a fascinating person. She's very bright. She's very thoughtful in the way that she views the world. That being true to herself also means having the courage of her convictions and standing up for what she thinks is right and It's very refreshing and quite inspiring to be in the company of someone like that, I found. I really felt like I learned from her and I wanted to learn from her. I felt like in a way it's a gift. It's all just been packaged up in this book and anyone can spend time in her company, I suppose. That's what I really liked about it. And it is funny. Often there'll be a little line or a paragraph or often they're just incidents, things she's done or situations she's been in, which she relates with great gusto. And they are very funny and enjoyable and shocking. I pulled a little bit I wanted to read out. She says, "We are all scared. We are all secretly shaking with fright inside, uncertain of what we should be doing, saying and thinking, anxious about what our lives are going to be. I believe that if you can allay those fears, if you can soothe people and hug them and make them feel it's going to be all right, you're doing a public service. Often most of us are too busy or worried or tired or just can't be bothered to take on the difficulties that another person is going through. But if you can, it makes the most enormous difference to try and understand the other person, to try and feel their pain, and to see the world through their eyes. This is at the heart of acting." So you get this person with this real gift for communicating, playing these parts, and she takes it very seriously. Also, she never messed around, even from the very earliest days when she was just finding her feet as an actress. She always took it seriously and had a sense that this is what she really wanted to do with her life. And there are lots of barriers to that. Even when she was young, she was no one's idea of a romantic heroine. Or, she was always quite funny looking and an unusual shape and not someone who really fitted. And she had to overcome all that. But her capacity for empathy, and I think through that for friendship, is one of the strongest things that comes through this book. And time and again, it's these passing connections, perhaps with people that you wouldn't necessarily notice or bother to forge a connection with, but she does because she sort of finds everybody equally interesting. These connections that she makes and these relationships with people then flourish into meaningful things that either bring her work or enhance her life in some other way. And it feels like this very rich existence through these social networks and these friendships and these relationships with people that I just found an absolute joy. It was really good. And the other thing I'd say about it that really surprised me is that I enjoyed all the anecdotes about the theatre world and the celebrities and the acting side. I mean, if you're someone who enjoys a good theatre world memoir, which I do, I love an actor's diary or something like that. I'm always really interested in that world, which is not my world. I've never ever experienced it, but so it's nice to see it through insiders' eyes. If you're someone who likes those books, this is great for that. It's really good. You get all of that. But I'd also say the thing that I was most interested in was the chapters about her family background and her parents' history and her grandparents and growing up. And then there's a brilliant section about her early career doing voiceovers for adverts and racketing around Soho and this flat that she shared with these other actors. And all of that just comes so vividly to life. The social commentary side of it was fascinating. And I almost wanted to read that more than I was enjoying the celebrity theatre showbiz side. So all in all, for me, it was a real surprise, a real delight, and a book that I would heartily recommend. I thought it was great. I thought it was really great.
It sounds great.
Have I sold it to you?
Yeah, I think you have sold it to me. I said this recently. It might be the kind of book that I pick up and read if I find it in the right moment, like in an airport bookshop or on a shelf at a holiday home.
It'd be a great plane read. Any situation where you're sort of like, you've got something slightly that's causing you anxiety or something you have to just sort of get through, I'd say, take this. It'd be brilliant.
There's a place for that. On the flip side, I did keep reading Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver on my flight back from Los Angeles a couple weekends ago. I spent a lot of time in the airport bookshop pondering buying a different book and then ultimately couldn't justify it because I had Demon Copperhead to read and it is a book club book. So at some point I was going to have to read it and there was no time like the present. All of which isn't to undersell the book itself, which, as we said in the introduction, has just won the Pulitzer Prize, is on the shortlist for the Women's Prize. And this was a fun fact you added, but has 22,000 five-star reviews on Goodreads.
I just saw that on the publisher's page and I thought, that's an intriguing stat. I'm going to stick that in there.
Does it have 30,000 one-star reviews? I mean, That's
a good question.
It does not. I could assure you, without checking, that it does not. It is a very finely crafted novel. Barbara Kingsolver, of all the authors I've talked about today, but full stop, she's one of the best, I'd say, alive today. Which isn't to say, of course, that you necessarily want her to go where she's taking you in this novel, which is a retelling of David Copperfield. The name here is Demon Copperhead, And she introduces us in exactly the same way as David Copperfield does, because I just checked, to our narrator on the day he emerges. And I'll just read you that very short first paragraph so you get a quick sense of the narrative voice. First, I got myself born. A decent crowd was on hand to watch, and they've always given me that much. The worst of the job was up to me, my mother being, let's just say, out of it. Have you read David Copperfield? Or just seen the recent film?
I don't think I have read that one.
Have you seen the recent film?
She says that like she's read all of Dickens. I've read 2 Dickens novels. Neither of them was David Copperfield. I think I've done Great Expectations and Oliver Twist.
I have also not read David Copperfield, but I have watched the recent movie with Dev Patel. Have you not seen that?
I have seen that.
Okay.
Yes. All my familiarity with the story comes from that. Yeah, that's a good film.
So that is a good film. Not least because Dev Patel is extraordinarily handsome in it. And he is so charismatic. So he plays the part perfectly. Coming back to Demon Copperhead, our narrator is born into the Appalachians, into deprivation. His mother is out of it when he's being born because she is, although it's a little bit foggy, she's either taken too many pills at that point or is so drunk that she's actually passed out. I think she's 17 or 18. Like, she's come through foster care. Demon Copperhead will eventually experience the same. So this is not light material. This is the dark side of America. It's set in recent time. So as the novel continues and as Demon gets older, the opioid crisis hits his community. You've read Empire of Pain about the Sackler family and Oxycontin, but I haven't. So I know it, and yet there's still cut into this novel shocking moments, but I haven't read that. So although I have visibility of the crisis, there's gently placed here some revelations that are, interestingly, they're revelations that don't even land particularly to our young narrator. They're said by other characters who are well versed in the context. In this case, it's a nurse, but just about the tactics of Purdue in targeting these communities where they could be selling pills through Medicaid to people who don't need them, and the addiction crisis that resulted. That's not the topic of this novel. Demon himself is the novel. It's his voice. It's his life experience. I haven't finished it yet. I'm still working towards the very end.
We should tell listeners at this point that it's, just looking it up quickly online, it's over 500 pages long, isn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't seem that long. Yeah, it is over 500 pages long.
560 pages.
If Phil was here, he'd say, but is that a long book, Kate?
Well, I think Phil would be like, that's edging towards long book.
I think for Phil, it's like 800 plus. Yeah, so it is longer. It's great storytelling. I have found some of it hard to read.
Emotionally.
Yeah, emotionally. But I think it's great that it's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and it's great that it's being read widely. In some ways, it's now this counterpoint to my fluff reading of romantic comedy and Pineapple Street, where it's showing this other side of America, and not just the lived experience, but she very gently tucks into the narrative these moments of revelation about how the community has been forced into this position, or how systemic decision-making has led them to remain impoverished. Like, for example, Demon Copperhead has this wonderful teacher who's Black and has come down, I think, from Chicago. He came down for a year or so to teach, and he fell in love, and he loves bluegrass, so he stayed. And according to the novel, there's very few Black Americans in Appalachia. And he's very committed to these kids. He's trying to make change. It lands kind of funny, but he's trying to explain to them about why their community is so impoverished. He's like, why do you guys think coal mines are the only jobs available? And they're like, well, I don't know. And he's trying to explain that there were handshake agreements between wealthy men about what would go into Appalachia. There was pushing out of any other type of industry to stop there being other jobs, so that the only jobs available were in the coal mines. And otherwise, it was just a kind of poverty and deprivation or departure.
As a graphic designer, what I find absolutely fascinating, even though it's not a very good discussion for radio, is the difference between the hardback cover of Demon Copperhead, which is a very beautiful, I'd say very sort of literary fiction, abstract blue background of some foliage, and then there are these beautiful gold stars picked out, almost slightly reminding me of The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So you've got all that going on in the hardback, and then the paperback, if anything, it looks like Shuggy Bain. It's got this photograph of a child looking wistfully out of, and he's looking sort of angrily actually out of some kind of, is it a school bus or some kind of, I think it's a school bus perhaps, or some kind of distressed building. Anyway, I just thought that was really interesting shift in the way they're positioning this book and the people that they're trying to get to pick it up, I guess.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't point out to you that the US and Canadian hardback is different again. I can hold it up for Kate. Again, sorry, listeners, this is not wildly interesting.
Yeah,
but I
hold
tell
it
you
down a bit, though. Yeah, I'd say still that's very lit fic, isn't it?
It is definitely literary, for sure.
That's almost going more with the whole Dickens vibe, that actually, isn't it? Almost like there's something a bit Victorian about it.
Yeah, it does have the Oprah's Book Club stamp on it.
Anyway, sorry, listeners.
We're going to talk about that book again. We're going to talk about it on the Women's Prize special episode coming up.
The difference between this conversation and that one is that by then I'll have read it and have an opinion. Although, I predict regular listeners, you will know me well enough to know that if any book is going to undo me, the last minute merchant, it will be Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. But I'm certainly fully intending to read it. All right, my last is Natalie Haynes' book Stone Blind, which I talked about very briefly at the end of our last bookshelf. I had just picked it up then. I went to a talk that Natalie Haynes did and was very, oh my goodness, she's so amazing. Like, I hadn't realised, but I'm so late to the party on this one. She's hugely popular and well known here in the UK, and I think internationally now as well. She is a classicist, so she lives and breathes Greek classics, and in that talk had a really interesting insight into her childhood and her education and what got her into it. In a way, I think she had a good, well, it's funny actually, she had a good teacher, but also a teacher apparently didn't like her very much because she was so nerdy and spotty, and I think he found her a bit tiresome. She was very funny about that. She also grew up watching a film that I know and love very much, which is called Clash of the Titans. Did you ever see that, the Harry Hamlin film?
I can't remember. I don't think so.
Blank. She's a bit younger than me, and also she's Canadian. Maybe it wasn't such a thing in Canada, but in the UK, it was that sort of thing. I was looking back, and it was true that there were certain films that you could rely on them showing at least once a year, maybe even twice a year, and you'd be like, oh, it's on again, great, and you call your sister and you both sit down and watch it again, and this was one of those. It's quite hammy, but it's just a great story. You've got Perseus, the heroic and completely gorgeous Harry Hamlin, half-clothed most of the time, and you've got some gods, and you've got monsters, and you've got Greece, and it's all very hot and atmospheric, and he goes on this quest where there are all these kind of MacGuffins. He has to get the thing and then do the thing and cut off the head of the thing in order to then get back and save his mother from having to marry someone she doesn't want to marry. In the book, what Haynes is interested in is Medusa. And I just wanted to read you the very beginning, which I think gives a good sense of where she goes with it. It says, I see you. I see all those who men call monsters. And I see the men who call them that, call themselves heroes, of course. I only see them for an instant, then they're gone. But it's enough. Enough to know that the hero isn't the one who's kind or brave or loyal. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he is monstrous. And the monster? Who is she? She is what happens when someone cannot be saved. This particular monster is assaulted, abused, and vilified. And yet, as the story is always told, she is the one you should fear. She is the monster. We'll see about that. And so this is the story from Medusa's point of view. And it's just a delight. It's so great. I absolutely loved it. It's this sideways look at the story that we know, the story that's been handed down from, was it Hesiod or someone who wrote about it originally?
I don't know.
There was a time when I had that fact at my fingertips, and I read this a little while ago now and I've forgotten. But yes, anyway, Greek classic mythology, and then obviously reinterpreted for my generation in this Hollywood film. So it is a story that you feel like you know, and yet this is that great thing about a very different perspective on it. And I loved it. I loved everything about it. I love her feminist slant. She's also very funny. She's very subversive, I think, in a way. That sounds like a negative thing, perhaps, but it isn't at all. It's brilliant. It makes you look at things differently. And what's really wonderful about that is that you carry some of that thinking into everything else that you're encountering in your life, which is really good. You suddenly start to question things. And I love the way that it prompted me to do that more, or reminded me not just to take things at face value so much. And also, it's just a really good story. You would think, wouldn't you, knowing what happened to poor old Medusa, and that's giving away totally where my sympathies lie at the end of reading this, that it would be a depressing read, but somehow she manages it not to be that. I think one of the reasons for that is the perspective you have on it. This is a story about gods and monsters, and it's not real in that sense, even though there are things in it to do with relationships and love and tenderness that are beautifully real and are the things that you carry away with you, and they're the things that steal into your heart and bring you joy. It was great. I absolutely loved it. And I then immediately ordered from the library her book, 1,000 Ships, which is her retelling of the Greek-Trojan War story, which I had been so utterly depressed by when we encountered it in Pat Barker's book, Silence of the Girls. Reading it now, I still love Natalie Haynes. I still love her take on it. I'm loving her voice. But I was reflecting, that is just fundamentally such a depressing story. There's no getting away from it. It's a story about the hideous slaughter, all based on the most illogical, irrational of reasons. It's just depressing. And even I think Natalie Haynes, I'm not sure she's going to be able to overcome that, but we'll see. I'm certainly happy to be reading her and something else by her. And I loved Stone Blind. I would totally recommend it. It's a great read. Also summer read, I would say. It's got that, beachy quality.
I am personally over the Greek mythological retelling.
I would have said I was too. I've done Madeline Miller. I've been there.
Well, and that's my question.
Well, she is friends with Madeline Miller to the degree that they check in with each other, apparently, before they decide who they're going to write about next, which I thought was really sweet. I would say it's as good as Madeline Miller in a different way. I think that's the thing. It's also a book that is going to have you turning the pages and absolutely brings it all to life and is incredibly enjoyable. But I feel like Natalie Haynes, if anything, perhaps has slightly more of an agenda with this. She really wants to teach you something. And I personally lap that up. I love that. Whereas I feel like Madeline Miller, in a way, is more of a pure storyteller. That was the only it's very, very reductive. They're both such nuanced, brilliant writers. It feels wrong to compare them. But I do definitely feel, if you like Madeline Miller, I think you will love Natalie Haynes. But they are different. They are different. It's not more of the same. That's the thing to take away, I think.
Okay. Good to know. I would love to hear from listeners, if you guys decide to read any of these books. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and we've probably chosen books that are far more, I don't want to say like accessible, but books that people are like, oh, okay, I'll give that a try.
I was going to supply the word accessible. Is accessible a dirty word?
I don't know. So there's a lot in here. I've got
plenty of new dirty words in my vocabulary after reading Miriam Margolyes, that's for sure. Hey, before you go, I'm not going to slow us down now because I know we're wrapping up, but I did just want to say, for any listeners who are interested in the book we talked about when we did our Snowball episode by Bridget Brophy called 50 Works of English Literature We Could Do Without, I ordered that book secondhand. It had to come all the way from America. That's the only place I could find a copy that was in print that I considered to be affordable, because there are copies around, but they're all quite expensive, sort of, 50 quid or whatever. But this was, I think, something like $12. And it took a few weeks, but it came. And it has been such a delight. I posted about it on Instagram, and then actually quite a lot of people got in touch because I think people were just really interested. And the chapters are so short. Each one is only 2 or 3 pages. So this is a book by Bridget Brophy called 50 Works of English Literature We Could Do Without. It's written with 2 other people, and they basically are going through the English lit canon and debunking it and just saying, oh my goodness, Beowulf, it's so boring, or really just a very honest analysis of, are these works really the works that we should be holding up and studying? And it's very iconoclastic, is that the word? But the thing is, they've all got such cast iron credentials as writers and critics and thinkers that basically I feel like they're able to pull it off in a way that you can't imagine anyone daring to do it now. I won't read any now, but I thought for a little podcast extra, for any listeners who are interested to hear, I might just read the chapter on Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which features in this book, which was one of the ones that particularly delighted me. I mean, I loved The Lighthouse. I was very shocked that it was in here at all. But listeners, if you want to stay tuned after the closing credits, I will read that for you and you can see what you think.
What are you reading next?
What am I reading next? What are you reading next? Tell me what you're reading and I'll think what I'm reading.
I am reading Grey Bees by Andrzej Kirchhoff, who is one of Ukraine's best-known, best-selling authors. And I'm going to be hearing him speak in early June with Kim from The Paper Hound. And he's going to be talking about his most recent book, which is his memoir from the first year of the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion. Grey Bees was written in 2018, so it was written when Russia had already invaded, but not the large-scale invasion that occurred in the last year. But when Russia first invaded and annexed Crimea, and what that led to was a front line between Russian-occupied territory and Ukraine. And this line isn't a sharp line, it results in a grey zone between the two armies, effectively. And that includes villages and houses. And most people have evacuated because there's rockets shooting all over top of them. But our protagonist is Sergei Sergeyek, and he is a beekeeper, and he stays with his bees. And that's all I should say for now. But I'm reading that. And I mean, talk about a palate cleanser after all the Americana I've been reading. So great to just dip into another culture, another lived experience, and a very, very different writing style from what I've read over the last few weeks.
The Paperhound is the lovely antiquarian bookshop in downtown Vancouver where we interviewed Kim, the owner, for our first Bookshopaholics episode. And she is an absolute delight. And I'm quite jealous of Laura getting to go and hang out with her at a writers' festival. That would be the dream.
You're just going to have to fly back. I mean, there's no way around it.
Yeah, that would be so nice. I am going to dive into Pod by Laline Poole, the next book for me on the Women's Prize shortlist. I was such a fan of Laline Poole's book, The Bees. I have recommended it to so many people over the years. I really enjoyed that book. Set in a beehive, very different beehive, I'm sure, from Andrei Kirchhoff's beehive. This is a kind of Quentin Tarantino beehive. I suppose, where there's blood and sex and violence and death and drama, and there's Flora, the worker bee, who has to solve some problem that's going on at the centre of the bee community. And actually, I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was very convincing, total page-turner, and actually with an ecological message, I thought that wasn't hammered home, but because you've got so invested in the lives of these bees in this beehive, it really, really stays with you at the end. You really care about them, which I think is sometimes the best way fiction can move you to care about something and try and do something about it. That's very good. So anyway, Pod is set under the sea, a school of dolphins. One thing I know Laline Poole can do very well is to write novels about characters that can't speak. She did it with bees, which only communicate by pheromones. I'm curious to see what she does with dolphins.
Lots of squeaking.
Yeah. Laura's looking very...
I can't make dolphin noises.
She's not a fan of anything involving it. Well, she, as regular listeners will know, she had a big problem with the talking tree in the Island of Missing Trees.
Oh, that's true.
I don't know if she's prepared to go there with dolphins. But yeah, I think it's going to be a fun one to discuss, that's for sure.
I'm almost tempted to read it for the discussion, but I don't know if I can do it.
Well, you've already read Demon Copperhead, so I feel like you've done the heavy lifting. So this could be light. Yeah, polish yourself in a couple of days.
The only time will tell.
Anyway, yeah, exactly. I'm very, very much looking forward to that recording. As ever, such a delight to chat books with you. Let's do another one soon. That's nearly it for this episode. Those books we talked about were Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld, Really Good Actually by Monica Heisey, Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson, This Much Is True by Miriam Margolyes, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, and Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes. In the Currently Reading Corner, we had Grey Bees by Andrei Kirchhoff and Pod by Laline Poole. And for a podcast extra, stay tuned for Bridget Brophy on The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, an extract from her book, 50 Works of English Literature We Could Do Without. Next up for us is one of our favourite episodes to read for and record, our Women's Prize Shortlist show. That's coming very soon, so keep an eye on your feed. This episode of the Book Club Review was edited and produced by me, Kate Slotover. Whenever you listen to this episode, if you have thoughts on it, we'd love to hear them. Comment anytime on the episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you'll also find full show notes, book recommendations and transcript. Comments there go straight to our inboxes, so drop us a line. We always love to hear from you. You can also sign up for our bi-weekly-ish newsletter. More ish than bi-weekly lately, I'm afraid. For extra reviews and recommendations, and to find out about our Patreon stream and how you can support us there. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or get in touch anytime at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you enjoy our shows, one other way to support us, as ever, is to tell your bookish friends and help us find new listeners. But for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing. To the Lighthouse. No, no, is one's reaction to the title, and indeed to the whole book. All that quivering, shivering, semi-luminous fabric which is not life, but serves to drape in artistic folds over life. Virginia Woolf's work is like some beautifully painted, delicately tinted old parchment, which has been made into a lampshade after a labour of several years. It has been done very carefully, with a great deal of thoughtful application, and with taste. Life is rather like that, Lily thought. Actually, Lily doesn't think quite that thought, but she is given a stream of consciousness equally banal. She shares this with the other characters in the book. Despite their different names and sexes, they all fuse into being one character. Not Mrs. Ramsay, but Mrs. Wolfe. Mrs. Wolfe holds in her hands, or rather rocks gently on her lap, but with hands lightly extended over it as if guarding its fragility, this exquisitely wrought parchment lampshade. She is wondering what to do with it. Her thoughts will in a moment go flying off, not probably at anything so sharply direct as a tangent, but in some graceful parabola which trails behind it a row of dots. The lampshade will turn into an exotic flower, perhaps a water lily of ivory pallor, which will float against the sea-green material of her tweed skirt. The skirt itself, with its surprisingly rough texture, may prompt another of what she calls thoughts, recalling the sensation of going up the cottage stairs, brushing against the wall as one inevitably had to, in the confined space of that absurd little place they had lived in before Prue was born. But that's over and done with. Back she comes to reality. She looks again at the lampshade and gives it several severe stitches round the edge, just to keep it from unwinding. Nonsense, really, all this dreaming. How one deplores it. It wastes time. Yet there remains something flower-like about a lampshade, let the men say what they will. She wonders why they don't come and get their coffee. Yes, just as she thought, it has gone cold, and the maid will have to make it fresh. Each coffee cup is like a miniature inverted lampshade. The lampshade, as she abruptly stops rocking it, is rather like life. But is that really true? What is true is that many pages can be filled on this principle. What is not true is that the result can be called a novel. It is often supposed that Virginia Woolf brought to the novel a particular quality called art. Her novels would, by this definition, not be naturalistic. A trip to the lighthouse would have a symbolic importance. Events would take second place compared with sensations and thoughts. The pattern of life would dominate mysteriously. People would themselves be treated as works of art. All this art is indeed in Virginia Woolf's books. Before she settles down to make her lampshade, she lays out the materials for our admiration. In one delicate hand, she lifts up the delicate skein of ribbon which she intends to bind it with. We exclaim at the subtle colour, immediately seeing how effective it will look woven in and out. So much artistry must announce a work of art, and yet the result remains very much a lampshade. And far from being remote from life, as we were expecting, far from being over-intellectual, it is positively homely. Virginia Woolf has filled the novel with people as banal as, if not indeed much more banal than, ourselves. They may look like precious works of art, and skill may have gone into evoking their mental processes, but the unremitting triviality of their minds is comparable to nothing human, being closest perhaps to the dripping of a faulty tap. They constantly exclaim about being alive, perhaps nagged by some doubt on the subject. For the rest, they have the past to think about, their painting or their knitting, their visual senses to keep keen, but seldom their oral ones, and life. Quite what this is, none of them know, but they suspect it's important. There it was before her. Life, life, she thought, but she did not finish her thought. This is not parody. It might come from any of the novels, probably does, but may be read in To the Lighthouse, which is usually considered one of Virginia Woolf's finest achievements. But what is the artistic achievement of reducing human experience to the gossipy level of the shallowest layer of consciousness? We are all conducting Virginia Woolf novels inside ourselves all day long, thinking how the sunset clouds look like crumbling cheese, wondering why the dinner party guests don't go, puzzling about children growing up, noticing for the first time the colour of a bus ticket. This famed sensitivity is everybody's birthright, and probably Virginia Woolf was applauded first by those who were delighted to find literary expression of their own commonplace sensations. To have those put in a book and called a novel, ... Only dots can do justice to their delight. To compare the results with James or Proust would occur only to the Inglit mind, always timid before the vigour of real art, and always happiest with genteel, diluted versions of it. Virginia Woolf's is a supreme example of the non-art that is at the same time inevitably, for the art v life dichotomy is a false one, devoid of vitality. Those who praise Mrs. Woolf's work should be honest with themselves. They are a potential audience for today's equivalent, Mrs. Dale's Diary. Not knowing what that is, that reference is somewhat lost on me. I love To the Lighthouse. I still love it, despite what Bridget Brophy thinks of it. But I did think that was a very well-written critique of it.